So welcome everybody to PDM administration training. This is an introductory session just to learn about the basics of PDM. Your host, so my name's Eric Van Essen. I oversee our product line here at Javelin. I've been with Javelin 12 years, and about the last 11 years I've had a strong focus on helped out with PDM. So currently I oversee a number of products, but PDM is one of them that I'm intimately involved with. I am certified to be as a specialist for PDM and certified in SOLIDWORKS as well. Just a quick warning, before we proceed, I do want to make sure that everybody's aware that if you are the main PDM administrator at your company, highly recommended to attend a proper PDM administration course. We just see this time and time again where customers are trying to self-implement and do a little bit, maybe too much without the proper knowledge. And we totally encourage independence, but I guess, just to put it out there, it can be more costly to repair mistakes than it can be just to get it right and get the proper knowledge to begin with. So please consider proper admin training and get certified yourself. All right, so the key topics that I thought would be appropriate for an introductory PDM admin course is going through the process of creating a brand new vault. I'm talking about creating folder structure. Then we'll talk about groups and user permissions and settings. And a core part of PDM is the data that you're tracking for your files. So we'll talk about data cards and variables. And then lastly, we'll end off on some basics of a workflow, what is it, and really the most important aspect is how does it control revision scheme. And if time permits, we'll do a Q&A. So just a huge amount of content here today, so hopefully we get through it all. So to start off, we'll talk about creating a brand new vault. So I'm going to access the PDM administration application. So you can do this through your tools drop-down menu if you're within a vault, or in your start menu you can search for administration and you should have access to it. And you do need to have a login for it. So there is a default admin login. You'll see the name of your server that's hosting the PDM vaults, and you can create a new vault. Okay, so I'm going to go next. There's two types of vaults. We have professional and standard vaults, so it depends on what you have installed. I have a PDM professional installed, but most of what I'm doing today is really available on standard as well. So we'll do PDM training test vault as that. So we'll just do something for today. Go next. This is where it stores the backend data. So the files can be stored on a separate server, but usually in an archive on the exact same server that's hosting the database. And then we have an opportunity, or then you attach it to the database, and what's the database name for that vault. So a lot of this is wizard base and next. This is how it communicates for the license server, and we're going to hit next there, which is fine. At this point, we have an opportunity to change the date format. So you want to follow a date format that follows, as close as possible to what you follow internally. Copy the same default admin password, and then you have a choice of a starting vault. I could create an empty one. There's a default, or there's a quick start. Personally, I'm a big fan of the default one because it has a lot of great content that I like leveraging, and I feel like it's easier to delete content than it is to clean it up. An example of that is going through this list. So you can check off, if when in doubt, you could check off everything if you like. But the main ones I wanted to point out is if you are a PDM professional users, and if you're using 2017, there's really some really nice new task automation that this is your opportunity to add it. So you can add tasks that will automatically convert your SOLIDWORKS files to PDFs, DWGs to PDF, Office documents to PDF. So it's a lot of automation that you can add. Some of that I'm going to cover in the more advanced webinar, the refresher, that's directly after this. Let's go to finish. And at that point, the PDM administration is going to go and create a new vault. So pretty straightforward. I just wanted to start off with that because I just want to make sure you guys are aware that we're not doing any magic here today. I'm literally starting with a brand new vault for the training today and give you a sense of how easy it is to get started with administration. Let's go and create folder structure for this vault now. So I'm going to go back into the administration panel. So we can see this is the PDM training test vault is the one I created. And the first thing I need to do is when I'm on a user computer, I need to add a vault view for it. So if you right-click on it, you have the ability to create local view. And you can use the default or the admin password that you guys have set up during the installation. And then we have an opportunity to select where you want the local vault view. My recommendation is to keep all your vault views, if you have multiple vaults, on the C drive. Most importantly, what you do want to do is make sure that they are consistent for anybody that has a vault view. So you want to make sure that everybody who has this particular vault view has it in the exact same location. It's not, not absolutely necessary, but I do find that it can be helpful when if you're sending hyperlinks to files, that those hyperlinks work better, obviously, if they're pointing to the same spot. So there's different opportunities to share files around. And now, the beauty about using SOLIDWORKS PDM is that it's Windows Explorer based. So I'm starting with the blank folder structure, and really if I want to create a folder structure, what I should do is just hit New Folder and start building it up. So I'm going to create a new, maybe administration folder. We'll do a new folder for projects. We'll do a new folder for maybe library. And yeah, that's pretty good for now. So the idea is that you can just go and create new folders using that admin login. And you can go underneath there and create subfolders, but it's no different than Windows Explorer. You can actually drag and drop a folder structure from Windows Explorer as well. So pretty straightforward to get kind of a base structure started. The next webinar as well, I'll talk about how we can automate some of that folder structure to keep it nice and organized. But that's kind of the starting point, is just getting those folders started. So let's move on to groups and user permissions. I'm going to go back to that admin panel and go in the same vault that I just added. So we did PDM training test vault. And you'll notice that there's no groups, and the only user is going to be that admin user. So in order to start testing out groups and users, what you do want to do is create a couple sample users. The best way to do that is to right-click, select New, and we can go select from users that we've added in the past. In this case, I'm going to add myself, Eric. I've used it on other vaults. And you can just hit Next. And then you have an opportunity to go and add more information about the user. So this would be helpful when you are communicating with others and you're seeing who's got what checked out. It can be really handy to supply their phone numbers or extensions or emails directly in there. And that's just a way to make sure that people are communicating appropriately as they're navigating around and working with each other. I can go through and add all these permissions here, but the best way to do it is to add this user to groups. So I could add them to groups now if there was groups available, but I don't have that available. So this is literally all I need to do for a user. Select OK. So now I have two users, that admin login and my login Eric. Let's go over to groups. So groups, again, is the best way to control permissions and how users interact with the vault. So I'm going to right-click, select New Group, and we'll call this Designers. Select Next. And then what we can do is go and add the group members. So I'm going to add, and I'm going to say Eric is going to be one of the designers. Now when it comes to permissions, permissions are broken out into really all these different categories on the left. So I don't have time to go through all of them today, but I'm going to go through over the most critical ones. There's administrative privileges. So administrative privileges are ones that you can have partial access to some of the administration that we're going over today. Just an example of something that you might want some users or power users at least have access to is something like search forms. Search forms and search favorites. You can have users set up and use those obviously if they know what they're doing, but it really can't do much harm. You're never gonna lose data. You're really just allowing people to be more productive. So stuff like that is quite common for us to allocate to broader audience. It's not, the nice thing about administration is that it's not all or nothing. Folder permissions are really important in the structure of the vault. I've seen this happen a lot where users select the top level of the vault and they say, you know what, let's give all permissions to, or permissions to everything in the vault. But the biggest thing that I've seen, or biggest issue I've had with that, is that the vault ends up a mess. And I find that users, when they give too much permissions, or companies when they give too much permissions and everybody's free to do, you know, what they want, it just feels disorganized, and it makes people dislike the working in the vault more because they just can't work efficiently, right, and find stuff because it's not consistent. So a better way to go about doing that is going into the individual areas, at least at the highest level, and what should users do at that level. So in this case, I'm going to actually, I am going to give full permission at these sub-levels, so at the libraries and at the projects. But at the administration, I'm not going to give any permission, and I'm not even going to give read access for the time being, just to show you what that looks like. You can always monitor the assigned folder permissions, so you can go through and see which ones are assigned, and I can remove them from here as well, and that's kind of a quick way to remove permissions. And a nice thing is, if you do have files below this, so say you had a specific project that you wanted to remove permissions from, it's actually not an additive thing. You can actually, it drills down into the subfolder, so it always looks at what the closest folder is to where you're browsing. So if I had a project within here, I could go in there in the sub-project and remove permissions and make it invisible. So that's a common thing for, you know, for restricting access for higher sensitive data. Let's go and take a look what that looks like. So to test it out, what I'm going to do is log off myself. And it's tough to see this because I'm doing it on the other screen, but in the bottom right, you can hit, in the task pane, you can hit the blue dot for your vault. And I'm going to log off my vault, and I'm going to log in using my new login. So I'll just show you the login here in a minute. So I have my new login, and I'm going to log in with Eric. Okay. When you log off like that, in the Windows Explorer area, it's going to automatically boot you back to the desktop. The quickest way to browse back to where you were is just hit the back button, and you'll right away end up exactly where you were. What I wanted to point out is something that's a very common thing when customers are getting used to PDM for the first time. They see a combination of these green folders and these gray folders, and it could be gray folders and gray files. This is an important thing to be aware of. The green folders are folders that are live access to the vault. The grayed out folders is information which is just cached locally, but is not actually have, or I don't actually have, there's no access to that to the vault right now and no permissions. This brings up a really important point that I wanted to talk about groups and users, and that when you're dealing with groups and users, if you double click, you access all of the permissions. But when you right-click and go to Settings, there's other options available, and this is really about the experience of somebody involved. It has much less to do with permissions and is more to do with preferences. So the preferences are in the settings, the permissions are in if you double-click. Okay, that's a real key thing to be aware of when you're getting used to users and groups. Again, I don't have time to go through all of these. Highly recommend that, you know, if you're not taking PDM admin training, to make sure to be intimately familiar with the help file. But the one that I will point out, because it does come up a lot, is this Explorer view. So if you click on the Explorer view, you can see that I have the option, do I want to see all my files, show only the files that are part of the file vault, or show only local files? In all honesty, I'm not sure why this last option exists. It's kind of ridiculous because who would ever want to see only local cache stuff and not stuff that's part of the vault? So really these top two are the two options. And I'm a big fan, you know, for users who know exactly what they're doing, it's not a bad idea to see local files, because there are rare cases where you might have a local file that you need to go and manually add to the vault and it's not added yet and it might be confusing and whatnot. But in all honesty, for the most part, users are better off if they show only files that are part of the file vault. So I'm going to select that as the option, select OK. And in order to see that reflected, I do actually need to log off and log back in. So I'm just going to do that one more time. I'm going to log off myself. I'm going to log back into the same vault again. Actually, I can just hit back. It'll force me to log in, like so. And then you see that administration folder that was grayed out before is now gone. So again, just to reiterate, that came about because of that setting. So it's a preference, it's not a permission. And it's important to be aware of both as you go through. Let's keep moving along here. Again, on any of these topics, by the way, feel free to type in questions if you wanted to see anything more. If time permits at the end, I'm happy to dive back into them to touch some more. I just thought I'd touch on some high-level areas just to get more familiar as we go through. So next up is data cards and variables. In order to manipulate and work with data cards and variables, it's best to add some file types that we want to experiment with. And I'm going to show you this. And I'm about to get an error, but I wanted to show you this anyway because it's an error that a lot of customers have when they first get started. I'm going to drag and drop a file in, and you're going to notice that even though I gave myself full permission on that folder, I don't have permission to add a file to this vault. And when you're getting used to PDM for the first time, this can be a very frustrating thing. So this is a very key thing that I wanted to bring up. Let me browse back to the administration and so forth. And I wanted to bring up, before I move on to data cards, one final thing on groups and users. And that's a really critical thing related to permissions. Although folder permissions are really important on how somebody can interact with different areas of the vault, an equally as important permission is the state permissions. Every single file that gets added to the PDM environment is required to be in a workflow. And the file needs to meet the qualifications of the workflow, and the user who's adding the file needs to have the right permissions for that workflow as well. In this case, what I'm going to do, just to kind of shortcut a little bit, because I am going to talk a little bit more about workflow at the end of this webinar, and more again in the next webinar afterwards. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take state permissions for that group, box select every single state in that default workflow, and in this case, I'm going to give myself full permissions to every single state. I am going to maybe back off one notch here and say, you know what, when it's approved, I actually don't want every permission. I'm going to say I can just read file contents. So without getting into all the granular capabilities of what you can do and can't do at different points in time, and what, the recommendations maybe are more or less, in my opinion, a good starting point is read file contents that are approved, and other statuses, if you want flexibility, just give full access on the states. It's kind of a good starting point. That's going to be, avoid some of the frustration. Now, this isn't a mandatory one. You want to think about who can do what during this. And really, this is where you start breaking up into different roles. But the transitions is where you pass files from one status to another. I'm going to leave them, actually, I'm going to give no permissions to transitions yet, because I'm going to talk about that as part of the workflow. And I don't require them to add files. So now that I've done that, I'm going to go back to the vault and add some sample files. I'll just drag and drop some sample files in. And you'll see that now those files are checked out by myself. Okay? So the topic I wanted to focus on now is the next topic is the data card. So when you click on a file, or if you click on a folder, or really if you click on anything in the vault, you get a data card. So it's a really key aspect of the vault is this data card. And the data card is what controls the information It could come from a number of sources. It could come from custom properties of SOLIDWORKS files. Information could be driven down from a project, so all this project information might drive down into the files themselves. It could be used in bill of materials, or it could be manually entered. And it could also be manipulated as part of workflow. You know, for instance, if somebody approves a file, their name and today's date should end up on that file as the person that approved it on that date. Again, that's something I'm doing in the more advanced one, but those are examples of more advanced data manipulation. So data cards, you know, are quite important to your Vault setup. There's a pretty decent one here that you should be aware of, but it's always worthwhile to think about what's important to me. So I'm clicking on a file and I see the data card. When you're working on a data card, it's nice to see the result as you're working. So what I've done in the past is just take that file or that folder and just drag that over to the right. And then when you go into the administration tool and drag that to the left, you have an opportunity to go and browse into the cards area. So there's 5 different types of cards here. File cards and folder cards are the ones I just showed you. Item cards are, there's an aspect of the PDM Vault called items that, in all honesty, a very, very small percentage of customers use because most of what you can do in there you can do with virtual files anyhow. So most customers, I recommend that they don't really go towards items because I just don't see it an area that SOLIDWORKS is investing in. But it's available and does solve some issues and some goals that customers have. Search cards are used for us doing performing searches. And then template cards are used for launching new templates to help keep to company standards. Okay. So let's go and edit the file cards. So I'm going to expand the file cards, and you can see that in brackets next to these file cards, you can see which files they're for. When I'm clicking on that part, you can see it's an SLD PRT, that's the card. So I have to look for that extension, SLD PRT, and it's called SOLIDWORKS Part Card, making it really easy to find. Let's double click that, and now we can start manipulating that card. So just a couple simple things. So first off, if there's things that you're looking at and you're like, you know what, I really don't see myself using that, I'd probably just go ahead and delete it. So now mind you, it's not a bad idea to learn about what these things do before you go deleting them, but a good idea to delete them. So let's take one like design checking as an example. I'm going to go and delete those. Let's go and delete those 2 fields. I can save that card, okay? And I just realized that I don't have permission to save that card, and that's actually because I'm working with my Eric login instead of the admin login. So I'm actually going to shift over to the admin login for this as I do some of this data card manipulation. Give me 1 second. So I'm logging off the admin and going back, or logging off Eric and going back to admin. Okay. So you can actually log off and log in without even leaving this this tool, which is nice. So let's hit save, and now I have permission to save. If I want to see the update, I can click on that file, and I can see that update, so that I don't have that information there anymore. Okay. Let's go make another change. So say for instance, created by author. Maybe I did want to add an approved by here. So I did want to track approved by. So let's go and add that as a field. So I can just drag and manipulate some of this card. You can box select fields if you want. So let's go and box select all this information down here so I have a little bit more room. And what I'm going to do is actually just take all those fields and do like a Control C and a Control V, just so I have similar information. Okay, like so. Okay, there we go. And now these fields, you can see that they're linked to, they're both linked to author, and these fields are, and the fields on the right are both linked to date. That's obviously not what I want. I want to break these out and link them to different variables. So to do that, you click on the field, and you select from the drop-down list of the appropriate variables. And in this case, approved by is available, so I can just select it. If it's not available, what I'd have to do is hit variables, and I'd have to go and add a new variable. So I go new variable and add it. Okay. Let's do the date. I'm going to manipulate that one and change it to a different date. So actually what I want to do is change it to approved on is a date specific to the approval, which is great. And then I hit save. Again, go over here, click on the file, and I can see that my card's being updated to track the information that I want. It's starting to look a little sloppy, so it is good to be aware of all these nice tools up here that help me clean up the card. Again, going a little bit beyond what we're what the scope of what we can cover today, but lots of great tools in order to get a really nice looking data card and track what you need to. The other thing that I wanted to touch on before I move on is the importance of linking information to custom properties. So say, for instance, I had the author and approved by and the dates, like the origination date and the approved by date. If I wanted those to end up on the title block of a drawing, which 9 out of 10 customers really do, you need to make sure that they're linked appropriately to the custom properties that you use on your SOLIDWORKS drawing. So hopefully you know the custom properties that you're using on your drawing today. In this case it's the part, but on the drawing is obviously would work the same way. And what you need to do is go to the variable for each one of these. So you can hit variables and bring up this variable editor. And this right area is how you link it to those custom properties. So in this case, what this is telling me is that approved on, the variable in PDM, is linked to a custom property called approved on, but it's only linked for PDFs. And in all honesty, I'm not actually sure why that's a default. There probably is some stuff related to PDFs where that's a good default and works out great, but in practice, the custom properties of PDFs are not nearly as important as a ton of other files, mainly SOLIDWORKS and Office documentation. So I can add new attributes and link it if I wanted to keep that one, but in this case I'm just going to manipulate it. So I do want it linked to a custom property, that's correct. Approved on is not the date that or not the custom property I use for my approval date. In fact, in SOLIDWORKS what I use is a custom property called approved date, okay, with no space. And then you need to add in the extensions. Which extensions would you like that to add for SLD-SDRW and SLD-PRT, that sort of idea? And if you do a lot of these, really what you need to do is have a go-to of this drop-down list. So this stores kind of all the key combinations as part of the default, and you should have one that you know that you use commonly. And there's no harm really in having too many extensions here, except for that it can be a little bit overwhelming to look at. So it's nice to see that you want to make sure, of course, that you get the right one. So all my SOLIDWORKS files, and if I am going to use the same thing for Office documents, you want to make sure that your key Office document extensions are in there as well. Select OK, and you're done. So I'm not going to go to the extent of showing that all in action, but that's a really critical part. If I want this field, which is, let me refresh that. Oh, sorry, one last thing. I forgot to change the text in front. So it still says created by and date. So I should change that so it's a little bit more meaningful, and I should say approved by. And you can keep it date because it's kind of intuitive that it's next to approved by. Up to you what you'd like to do there. Let's save that. And now when I click on a file, you can see approved by. So again, just to reiterate, this field right here, if I were to fill that in, ideally it's filled in automatically as part of a workflow, but when that gets filled in, now that I linked that to the custom property approved date, it will automatically update that file and update our SOLIDWORKS title block at the same time. That's something actually, again, I'm going to show in this the next webinar if you wanted to stay on the line for it. Okay. So hopefully that was informative for you, for everybody that's new to PDM administration. So again, that was kind of some basics of data cards and variables. There's obviously a lot more to it, but what you need to be aware of is that this is I consider it the heart of PDM, because the data that you're tracking and how you're tracking it is going to severely impact how productive you are as a team. Let's go on to our last topic of today's webinar, which is basic workflows and revision schemes. To demonstrate this, I'm actually going to switch back again, back to the Eric login, because I want to see how the workflows behave as a designer. There we go. Okay. So let's go back. All right. So the first thing you need to know about workflows is that, just to reiterate from before, every single file in the Vault needs to end up in one workflow or another. You know, a nice advantage of PDM Professional is that you can have an unlimited number of workflows, where PDM Standard, you're limited to one workflow. So in PDM Standard, all files end up in the same workflow is the only option. In PDM Professional, you can divide up files based on their properties, where they're stored, who's saving them, their extensions, you know, many different fronts. You can divide up files automatically. Files get added to your workflow by checking them in. So I'm going to hit check in on all those files. You can see that PDM is picking up those references. You can add a comment, so you can say initial check-in, like so. And then you can see that the status column is going to show me the state that those files get added to. Okay. You can see that information in the data card as well, because that was called out there, so it's under editing. And it's also seen under the version tab. So the version tab shows a little bit more information. You can see that the file's under editing, and it's in the default workflow. This is actually the only spot where you see the actual workflow name that file's in. Okay. So how does that look in the background, in the admin? Let's go and back over to the admin side. Where you can access workflows is right at the bottom of the administration. There's an area workflows, and if you double click on your workflow, you'll see this flow chart. So this is literally what's driving those files back and forth. So you know, really nice to work with, very intuitive in my opinion. But still takes some practice and knowledge to get familiar with and how it works. I'm going to, again, I can only go over the basics today because I wanted to keep it fairly concise and get you guys started. The first thing I want to point out is that that little symbol in the bottom right of under editing, that document with that star on it, that symbolizes that this is the first status in the workflow. If I click on it, you can see a check mark for that. So if you deselected that and selected a different one, you can start with files in a different status if you like. And that actually can be handy if you're migrating a lot of data in. Sometimes you want to temporarily have them migrated into a different status, in which case you can just change that out, what your default is so far. I was showing you before that you can control permissions at the group level, and you can do it for all the states there, but sometimes it's more intuitive to do it right while you're working on the workflow itself. So the permission that I added for the designers group shows up here. So I can see all the permissions that I added for designers. And just to reiterate that, or if you recall, on the approved status, I went to designers, and the only permission I added was read file contents. Okay, so that's what we have so far. The areas, just to get terminology straight, these buckets, or boxes, sorry, are called statuses or states. And the arrows in between we call transitions. Okay. In order to access a transition, you do need to have permission to it. So in this case, there's under editing, and there's waiting for, the only two possible arrows out are submit for approval to go to waiting for approval, or no approval required, in which it goes straight to approved. Okay. So both of these, if I wanted to have access to, I'd have to assign a permission. This one is really something that's meant for power users who know that they want to bypass and just move files around. And in my opinion, it shouldn't really be used. It's like, why bother with that? So in order to have access to this, you click on the transition, you can add the groups or users that you want to give permission to. In this case, again, I want to set up designers, like so. And then you click on the group and you permit them. Okay. Select OK. Save the workflow, and we're good. So the way that that shows up to the user is a couple spots, but to me the most intuitive is just in that right-click menu. When you right-click on a file and go to Change State, you now have the option to submit it for approval. If I wanted to give that other permission, so I'll just temporarily give it just to give an idea. So I'll add the permission for bypass, like so, and save. So now I just gave that permission to no approval required. If I right-click, now you can see both, no approval required or submit for approval. So that flow chart again is driving how we interact with those files. Let's go and submit that file for approval. You have an option here, and then you can say, please review. Something like that, and change state. And then you can see that status changing from under editing to waiting for approval. Okay. If I right-click on that file again and go to change state, you'll see that I don't have permission to approve. And that's because of my role. So I've only created one group so far, designers. Really the right way to do it is to create a different group of people that would be approving files and give them permission. Okay. If you do have users that approve each other's work, there's a way to do that without them proving their own work, which is nice too. But that's, again, a little bit beyond what I was planning on covering today. Let me go, it's quick enough to do, so I'm just going to show you, what I'd recommend doing there. Let's go and create a new group. So I'll call this, we'll call it approvers. You can call it managers or what you have you. Okay. And the most, really the key transition that you want to give them is past approval. So this one, so it goes from waiting approval to approved. So past approval is permitted. And the group members, just as usually it's different users typically, but in this case I'm going to add permission to Eric as well. So not only is my login Eric a designer, but I also have permission to approve. So now that I have permission to do that, I can right-click, go to Change State, and I have Past Approval. So it's a really key thing to be aware of, that the administrative privileges don't necessarily have to come from a single group. You can divide that up and use some strategy depending on the size and functionality that you'd like to accomplish with your team. When I pass approval, write a comment, looks good, select OK. You'll see that that file goes from waiting for approval to approved. The other really key thing that's happening in the background is the history. So as we did that, you can see we're building up a file and a history of the comments along the way, who did what, and in this case it's all done by my one login. And the last thing I wanted to point out is that at the end of the workflow so far, now that it's approved, it's stamped with revision A. So a really, really critical part to working in PDM, and the best practice, hands down, is to have workflow drive the revision. Now there's ways around it. You can try to do it without and just click and bump revision. But in my opinion, it's not the way you should be working. Workflow, no matter how simple you make it, should be the way that you drive and increment revision. And that's the best way to build up history, as it controls permissions, and it really keeps everybody working correctly as they work collaboratively together. So if anybody ever has a different opinion on that, I'm happy to discuss what might be alternatives. But ideally, in all honesty, what I'm going to do is probably convince you that workflow is the best way to go. Okay. I'm going to show you how that works, and I want to show you an example of changing revision scheme to end off this webinar. First of all, how that works. This workflow that came with this default vault, as it went through the past approval transition, there was an action that took place. There's two actions actually. The first action was setting the variable revision with the next revision counter. Why do we need to do that? Is so that it ends up on the title block when we're printing that file. So that's mainly for drawings. If you drive that down in there, if you were to print a drawing after it's been approved, it'll have the correct revision on the title block. The next action is bumping the revision. So it's an increment revision action. And then there's a tab here for revision numbers, and you can say that the revision number that I'm incrementing is the alpha revision component. Okay? So that's how it bumps. Let's go see what it takes to change that to numeric and just get a sense and get a little bit more grasp of how revisions work. Out in the administration side, there's revision components and revision numbers. Now I could go and create new components and new numbers, but then I'd have to go and update my workflow to start using those new number names and new numbers. Most customers only have one revision scheme. So usually what I do is take the existing one, or out of the box one, the alpha revision component, and just name it, because alpha doesn't really make sense. In fact, I can just take out alpha and I can call it revision number. And in the back end, the administration is set up such that that doesn't break anything. It's all pointed correctly and works well. Same thing for the component. You can take the alpha revision component, you can call that revision component, and instead of alpha, that's that ABC there, I can just back out and I can choose a different counter. So I can go to number, pick a 2-digit number. In this case, I like personally the idea of starting at 0 and select OK. So now we have a revision number, and it uses the revision component. And if I go into my workflow, you'll see that the counter is using, oops, that needs to be refreshed. It does use the right one, I promise. The counter is going to be using the revision component as well. Okay? So how does that behave? Let's go into the files, right-click on one of the SOLIDWORKS files, submit it for approval. Okay, let's do OK. So that's waiting for approval. And when I right-click and pass approval, select OK, it goes to approved again. The difference is that instead of alpha, we're getting 00. So you can see local revision component. In the history, you can see 00. And if you were to go to the data card, you're going to see 00 as well. The data card, just to reiterate, is the revision component, the revision variable that drives down into the file so that it can print properly and shows the right revision when you go to print. And I'll just take a moment to review the questions as well.